In 1988, inside a quiet stretch of working-class neighborhoods in Cleveland, a boy named Caius Arden Vale entered a life that seemed already decided for him. The story he grew up with was simple, clean, and never questioned. He had been adopted shortly after birth, placed into a stable household by a legal process that, according to everyone around him, followed the rules of the time. No one treated it as unusual. No one treated it as something broken. It was presented as a beginning, not a loss. Caius carried that understanding into every stage of his life. The people who raised him built consistency around him, structured routines, predictable expectations, and a steady sense of belonging that did not leave room for doubt. Family photos, school records, birthdays, and milestones all reinforced a single narrative. He had been chosen, not taken. The distinction mattered, even if he never said it out loud. It shaped how he explained himself to others and how he avoided questions that felt unnecessary. There was no single moment when the truth of adoption was revealed to him. It existed as something that had always been there, woven into memory so early that it felt inseparable from identity. He did not remember a conversation, only the awareness. Because of that, there was no shock, no resistance, no emotional rupture attached to it. It became a quiet fact that did not demand attention. The explanation he accepted never changed. His biological mother, according to what he had been told and what he later repeated to himself, had not been able to provide stability. Financial hardship, limited support, and uncertain living conditions had made it impossible for her to raise another child. The adoption had been framed as a responsible decision, one that ensured he would grow up in a secure environment. That framing removed any sense of abandonment. It replaced it with a kind of distant gratitude, even if that gratitude had no clear direction. Years passed without interruption to that belief. Caius moved through childhood and adolescence with the same internal structure, never driven to search, never pushed to question. He did not look for records. He did not ask for details. Even when others showed curiosity about their own origins, he remained detached from that impulse. For him, the absence of information did not feel like a gap. It felt like something that had already been resolved. At 18, a moment briefly threatened to shift that certainty. His adoptive mother approached him with a folder, documents that had been kept out of sight until then. The timing suggested intention, as if she believed he had reached a point where he could handle more than the simplified version he had been given. The presence of the folder introduced a different possibility, that the story might be more complex than he had allowed himself to imagine. But Caius did not open it. The decision came immediately, without hesitation. He refused the information before it could take shape in his mind. It was not fear in a dramatic sense, but a clear rejection of uncertainty. He chose stability over discovery, choosing to preserve the version of reality that had never caused him conflict. The folder disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, and the moment closed without consequence. That refusal defined the next decade of his life more than he realized. By not looking, he preserved the boundaries of his identity exactly as they had been constructed. He continued forward without disruption, building a career, forming relationships, and maintaining the same internal narrative that had guided him since childhood. Nothing in his daily life challenged it. Nothing forced him to reconsider. The absence of curiosity was not indifference. It was control. As long as he did not search, there was nothing to find that could destabilize what he already had. The idea of a biological past remained distant, abstract, and contained. It belonged to a different version of life that had never intersected with his own. In every measurable way, Caius Arden Vale existed within a complete story. A name, a family, a history that appeared consistent from the outside. There were no visible fractures, no contradictions that demanded attention. The system that had placed him where he was had done its job with precision, leaving behind no immediate trace of anything unresolved. And for nearly 3 decades, that was enough. By 2016, the structure Caius Arden Vale had relied on for nearly 3 decades began to shift in a way he could not ignore. The change did not come from memory, nor from anything his family said. It came from a form, a standard medical intake form, the kind filled out without thought, asking for family history. heart disease, genetic disorders, early deaths, patterns that extended backward beyond the individual. For the first time, the absence of answers carried weight. The question was no longer abstract. It was no longer about identity in a philosophical sense. It became immediate, practical, and tied to someone else. Caius was about to become a father. The responsibility moved beyond his own life and into the unknown territory of what he could not explain. The same silence that had once protected him now created risk. What had been easy to ignore now demanded definition. Until that moment, the lack of information had never interfered with anything tangible. Doctors had asked similar questions before, but the answers had always been the same: unknown, not applicable, unavailable. Those responses had never required follow-up. This time, the repetition felt different. The idea that he could not provide even the most basic biological context introduced a kind of instability he had never experienced. The shift did not happen all at once. It built gradually, moving from discomfort to urgency. Every assumption he had accepted without resistance began to feel incomplete. The story he had lived with no longer covered the questions that mattered now. The explanation that his biological mother had been unable to raise him remained intact on the surface, but it no longer answered what he needed to know. For the first time, Caius reconsidered the decision he had made at 18. The folder his adoptive mother had once brought into his room returned to his thoughts with a clarity that had been absent before. He understood what it represented now. Not just information, but access to something he had deliberately avoided. That moment, which had once seemed insignificant, now stood out as a turning point he had chosen not to take. The decision to revisit it came without hesitation. The same certainty that had once led him to reject the information now pushed him in the opposite direction. There was no gradual build-up, no extended period of doubt. The need had already formed. The only step left was to act on it. On April 11, 2021, Caius went back to his adoptive mother and asked for the folder. The request carried none of the resistance that had defined his earlier response. There was no hesitation in his tone, no attempt to soften the moment. The question was direct, and the answer came just as directly. The folder had been kept. Nothing had been discarded. Nothing had been altered. It had simply remained out of reach, waiting for a moment that had now arrived. When the folder was placed in front of him again, it no longer represented uncertainty. It represented resolution. The fear that had once existed was gone, replaced by a controlled expectation. Whatever was inside, it would be clearer than the silence he had lived with. The absence of knowledge had become more difficult than the possibility of truth. He opened it without delay. The contents did not match the story he had carried. At first, the discrepancy appeared in small ways: details that did not align, documents that referenced events he had never heard about. The language used in the paperwork introduced terms that had never been part of his understanding. There were references to legal proceedings, timelines that extended beyond a simple adoption, and names that had never been mentioned in his household. The deeper he moved into the documents, the clearer the pattern became. This was not a straightforward transfer of custody based on financial hardship. There were records of a complaint filed by his biological mother. There were indications that she had contested the loss of her child. The idea that she had willingly given him up began to fracture under the weight of the evidence. Each page added another layer of contradiction. The narrative he had accepted for years began to collapse, not through speculation, but through documented fact. The system that had presented itself as orderly and lawful revealed inconsistencies that could not be ignored. What had once been framed as a clean process now appeared complicated, contested, and unresolved. The most significant realization did not come from a single document, but from the accumulation of them. The pattern they formed pointed toward interference, someone positioned between the biological family and the legal system shaping the outcome. The presence of a social worker's name appeared repeatedly, connected to multiple stages of the process. The role described in the paperwork did not match the authority implied by the decisions that had been made. The conclusion did not arrive as a theory. It emerged as the only explanation that aligned with the evidence. The adoption had not unfolded as it had been described. It had been influenced, redirected, and ultimately controlled by forces that operated outside the version of events Caius had been given. The realization did not create immediate clarity. It created a different kind of uncertainty, one rooted in the understanding that the foundation of his identity had been constructed on incomplete information. The question was no longer whether he wanted to know the truth. The truth had already begun to reveal itself, and it was not what he had expected. What had once been a closed story was now open, and it could not be closed again. The deeper Caius Arden Vale moved into the documents, the less room remained for doubt. The pattern was no longer subtle. It did not rely on interpretation or speculation. It was built from direct statements, recorded claims, and official filings that contradicted everything he had been told. The story he had carried for nearly 30 years, of a voluntary decision made out of necessity, began to dissolve into something far more deliberate and controlled. One document stood out more than the rest. It was not written in neutral language, carried urgency, accusation, and a clear sense of loss. It came from his biological mother, Alaris Nix Rowan. The record showed that she had filed a complaint shortly after his birth. The language described a child taken under false pretenses, not given away. It referenced confusion, coercion, and the absence of informed consent. This was not the voice of someone who had made a choice. It was the voice of someone trying to reverse a decision that had never been hers. Caius did not need to interpret tone to understand what that meant. The presence of that complaint alone dismantled the foundation of the narrative he had lived with. If his biological mother had fought to get him back, then the version of events he had accepted could not be true in its original form. The adoption had not been a clean transfer. It had been contested from the beginning. The documents continued to align in the same direction. A name appeared repeatedly across multiple pages. Viral Thorncade, listed as a social worker, but positioned in a way that exceeded that role. The paperwork showed involvement at critical points: initial contact, hospital coordination, and the transition into legal custody. Each reference reinforced the same conclusion. This individual had not simply facilitated a process. He had shaped it. There were also records tied to the hospital where Caius had been born. The details were limited but consistent. The timeline indicated that his biological mother had been admitted under the expectation of medical support. Shortly after delivery, documentation shifted abruptly. The explanation given to her, recorded indirectly through the complaint, referenced complications and immediate intervention. Yet no follow-up records confirmed that narrative. Instead, the chain of custody moved directly into the hands of the social worker. The structure of the process became clearer with each page. It was not a random failure or a misunderstanding. It was coordinated. The biological mother was placed in a position of vulnerability, given incomplete or misleading information, and pressured into signing paperwork without full awareness. The child was then removed from that environment and transferred through a system that legitimized the outcome before it could be challenged effectively. Caius did not find a single document that explicitly described it as a crime. That was not how the system recorded itself. What he found instead was a sequence of actions that, when placed together, could only lead to one conclusion. The adoption had been built on a manipulated foundation. The legality that followed did not erase what had happened before it. Another layer of information deepened that realization. There were references to additional complaints filed around the same period. Not identical cases, but similar in structure. Different names, similar patterns. Vulnerable mothers. Intermediaries controlling access. Children placed into new households before disputes could be resolved. The repetition suggested that this was not an isolated event. Caius understood what that implied without needing confirmation. If the system had allowed it to happen once, it could allow it to happen more than once. The presence of multiple cases pointed toward something broader, an environment where oversight was limited and authority could be used without accountability. The role of the social worker became more than individual responsibility. It became part of a larger failure. The realization did not come with immediate clarity about what to do next. It came with a shift in perspective. The life he had built remained intact, but the origin of that life no longer fit within the boundaries he had accepted. The stability he had relied on had been constructed on a version of events that excluded the experience of the people he came from. There was no indication that his adoptive family had orchestrated any of it. The documents did not point in that direction. They appeared as participants within a system that presented itself as legitimate. Their role, based on what he could see, began after the critical decisions had already been made. That distinction mattered, even if it did not resolve the larger issue. What remained unavoidable was the fact that his identity had been redirected before he had any ability to define it himself. The records did not leave space for an alternative explanation. The removal from his biological family had not been a mutual agreement. It had been an action taken under pressure, supported by authority, and solidified through legal structures that prioritized stability over origin. Caius did not close the folder when he reached that point. There was no sense of completion. The information did not feel like an ending. It felt like an opening. One that led into a past he had never known and a set of questions that could no longer be ignored. For the first time, the idea of his biological parents was no longer abstract. They were no longer defined by absence or assumption. They were present in the record, actively searching, actively resisting, and ultimately overruled. And that changed everything. The documents did not stop at proving that something had gone wrong. They extended beyond the moment of separation and revealed what followed. For Caius Arden Vale, the most difficult realization was not just that his biological mother had lost him under false circumstances, but that she had never accepted that loss. The record made that unmistakably clear. Alaris Nix Rowan did not disappear from the timeline after his birth. She remained present, persistent, and active. The paperwork showed a sequence of filings, complaints, and repeated attempts to recover her child. These were not isolated actions. They formed a pattern of continuous effort, stretching from the immediate aftermath of the birth into the months and years that followed. Alongside her, another name appeared with increasing frequency: Selim Drax Rowan. Initially, the records described him as a partner without formal legal standing. That detail mattered within the system they were facing. Without marriage, his authority in the case was limited. His position could be dismissed, reduced, or ignored depending on how the court chose to interpret it. The documents reflected that imbalance clearly. At some point within that early period, the status between them changed. A marriage certificate appeared in the file, dated after the initial complaint. It was not presented as a personal milestone. It functioned as a legal adjustment, an attempt to gain recognition within a system that had already begun to move against them. The decision to formalize their relationship was not about ceremony. It was about leverage. Even with that change, the imbalance did not disappear. The system they were entering operated on criteria that extended beyond legal status. Socioeconomic evaluation appeared repeatedly in the documentation. Reports described living conditions, employment stability, and household structure. These assessments did not remain neutral. They influenced the direction of the case. The contrast between the two households was recorded in a way that left little room for interpretation. On one side, Caius's adoptive family was described as stable, financially secure, and capable of providing long-term support. On the other, Alaris and Selim were characterized through their limitations: irregular income, shared living arrangements, and a lack of consistent resources. The language used in those reports framed the situation as a comparison rather than a question of origin. That framing shaped the outcome before the final decision was even issued. Caius found documentation referencing a judicial review that took place after the initial complaint. The case had reached a judge. The expectation, based on the existence of the complaint, would have been an investigation into the circumstances of the child's removal. Instead, the focus shifted. The decision-making process emphasized where the child currently was and what environment could be considered more stable moving forward. The distinction was critical. The question of how the separation had occurred became secondary. The question of where the child should remain became primary. The ruling reflected that shift. The judge ordered that the child, Caius, would continue to reside with the adoptive family. The reasoning cited stability, resources, and long-term security. The documentation acknowledged the biological parents' claim but did not prioritize it. Their attempt to reclaim their child was recognized but ultimately overridden. The effect of that decision extended beyond the immediate case. It created a barrier that became increasingly difficult to challenge. Once the placement was formalized under court approval, the process of reversal required a higher level of proof, greater legal support, and sustained resources, none of which were consistently available to Alaris and Selim. The records showed that they did not stop after the ruling. There were continued efforts, additional filings, repeated inquiries, attempts to reopen aspects of the case. Each attempt followed the same pattern: submission, review, and eventual dismissal or delay. The system responded, but it did not change its position. Caius also found indirect references to the environment surrounding those efforts. Notes from administrative offices indicated frequent visits, repeated requests for information, and ongoing pressure from the biological parents. The persistence was documented, but it was not rewarded. It became part of the record without altering its direction. The most difficult part to process was the consistency of that effort over time. The narrative he had lived with suggested a single decision made at one moment. The documents told a different story, one of continuous resistance, repeated denial, and a system that gradually reduced the visibility of those efforts until they no longer influenced the outcome. There were also indications that the case was not isolated within the broader system. References to other filings, similar complaints, and overlapping names suggested that Alaris and Selim were not the only ones navigating this process. The structure that had affected Caius extended beyond his individual case, reinforcing the idea that what had happened was part of a larger pattern. Through all of it, one fact remained unchanged. From the moment of his birth, there had been people actively trying to bring him back. Their efforts had been recorded, processed, and ultimately denied, but they had not been absent. They had been present in every stage, even when the outcome did not reflect it. For Caius, that realization altered the meaning of everything that had come before. The absence he had accepted was no longer absence. It was distance created by decisions made outside of his control, reinforced by a system that had chosen stability over origin and finality over correction. And once that became clear, the story he had lived with could not return to what it had been. As Caius Arden Vale continued to examine the records, the individual story that had defined his life began to expand into something larger and far more unsettling. What had initially appeared as a single case of manipulation now showed signs of being part of a broader system, one that extended beyond a single hospital, beyond a single social worker, and into a network that had operated with consistency and protection. The documents did not present this as a formal organization. There were no direct statements naming it as such. Instead, the pattern emerged through repetition. Names reappeared across unrelated cases. Institutions overlapped. Procedures followed similar sequences even when the individuals involved had no direct connection to each other. It was not described explicitly, but it was visible through structure. Caius identified multiple files referenced in his own documentation, cases involving other mothers who had reported similar experiences. Each case followed a recognizable progression. A woman in a vulnerable position, often isolated or lacking resources. An intermediary, typically a social worker or someone positioned within a support system. A hospital setting where control over information was centralized. Then, a sudden shift, misleading communication, rushed documentation, and immediate transfer of the child into a different household. What followed in each case was also consistent. Attempts to recover the child through legal channels. Delays, dismissals, decisions that emphasized stability over origin, and eventually silence. The system did not need to conceal itself completely. It relied on complexity and authority. By distributing responsibility across multiple roles, medical staff, social services, legal institutions, it ensured that no single point of failure could easily expose the entire process. Each participant operated within a defined function, and each function could be justified on its own. The role of Viral Thorncade became more significant within that context. His name did not appear in every case, but it appeared often enough to establish a pattern. He functioned as a connector, someone who moved between environments, linking the hospital to the legal process, linking vulnerable individuals to outcomes that they did not fully control. The documents never described his actions as illegal. They described them as procedural. That distinction allowed the system to continue without interruption. Caius also found references to judicial decisions that mirrored the outcome of his own case. Different judges, different courts, but similar reasoning. The emphasis on the best interest of the child was applied consistently, but the criteria used to define that interest favored financial stability and institutional validation over biological connection. Once a child had been placed into a household that met those criteria, reversing that decision became increasingly unlikely. The system reinforced itself through time. The longer a child remained in a new environment, the stronger the argument became for leaving that placement unchanged. Emotional attachment, continuity, and developmental stability were cited as reasons to avoid disruption. Those arguments did not address how the placement had occurred. They focused only on its current state. That approach effectively erased the origin of the problem from the decision-making process. For the biological parents, this created a narrowing window of possibility. Early intervention was required to challenge the placement, but the system itself created delays that pushed cases beyond that window. By the time a hearing occurred, the circumstances had already shifted in favor of the adoptive family. The structure was not neutral. It directed outcomes toward a specific result. Caius understood that his own life had been shaped by that mechanism. His presence in a stable household had been used as justification to maintain that placement, regardless of how it had begun. The legality that followed did not correct the initial action. It reinforced it. There were also indications that oversight had been limited during that period. Regulatory reviews were mentioned but lacked detail. Complaints were recorded but did not lead to systemic change. The presence of multiple cases suggested awareness, yet the absence of intervention suggested inaction. Whether that inaction was due to negligence, institutional protection, or resource limitations was not clearly defined in the documents. What was clear was the outcome. The system continued. Caius found no evidence that the cases had been revisited at a higher level. No indication of a comprehensive investigation. No record of accountability for those who had operated within the system. The absence of resolution extended beyond his personal history into the broader context in which it existed. At the same time, the documents made it clear that his adoptive family had entered the process at a point where the outcome already appeared legitimate. There was no record suggesting that they had been informed of the earlier complaints. No indication that they had participated in or benefited from the manipulation knowingly. Their role began within the framework presented to them, and that framework had already been shaped. That distinction did not resolve the situation, but it defined its boundaries. The more Caius understood, the more he recognized that his story could not be isolated from the system that produced it. His identity, his upbringing, and the life he had built were all connected to a process that had operated beyond his awareness. The realization did not change the life he had lived, but it changed how that life could be understood. What had once seemed like a single point of origin now extended into a network of decisions, actions, and omissions that spanned institutions and individuals. The simplicity of his past had been replaced by complexity, and that complexity could not be reduced back into a single narrative. There was no document that closed the case. No statement that resolved the contradictions. What remained was a structure that had functioned effectively enough to define the lives of multiple people, while leaving behind just enough evidence to reveal that something had been fundamentally wrong. And for Caius, that understanding marked the point where the past stopped being something he had inherited and became something he would have to confront. Once the system revealed itself for what it was, Caius Arden Vale reached a point where passive understanding was no longer possible. The documents had answered one question but created another, more immediate one. Whether the people who had spent decades searching for him were still out there, and whether any connection remained possible after so much time had passed. The timeline placed his birth in 1988. The most recent records in the file suggested that formal attempts to reclaim him had diminished years later, not because the effort had ended, but because the system had stopped responding. There were no final statements declaring closure. There was only the absence of further action within official channels. That absence left one possibility open, that the search had continued outside the system that had failed them. Caius did not approach this as an emotional impulse. He approached it with the same methodical focus he had applied to the documents. The information he had was incomplete, but it was not empty. Names, locations, and fragments of identity were enough to begin. He started with what was available in the present public records, digital traces, and the interconnected systems that defined modern communication in the United States. The process did not require specialized access. It required persistence and the ability to connect fragments that, on their own, appeared insignificant. Social media platforms, public databases, and archived references became the primary tools. The same systems that had not existed when he was born now provided a path that had not been available to anyone searching for him in the past. He began with the name Alaris Nix Rowan. The name itself was uncommon. That fact worked in his favor. It reduced the number of false leads and allowed him to focus on a smaller set of results. Variations appeared, as expected, misspellings, partial matches, outdated records, but the core identity remained traceable. Within a matter of hours, he identified several potential connections, each requiring verification. The second step was cross-referencing. Locations listed in older records were compared against current data. Dayton, Ohio remained central to the search. That continuity narrowed the field further. Public records indicated individuals with related names who had maintained a presence in that area over time. The probability of connection increased. Within 48 hours, the fragmented data aligned into a single, consistent result. A profile appeared, connected not directly to Alaris, but to another name that had surfaced in the documents. A sibling. The file had mentioned the existence of other children within the biological family, though it had not provided detailed information about them. That absence became an entry point. The individual connected to the profile shared the Rowan name, the geographic location, and a timeline that aligned with the events recorded decades earlier. Caius did not approach the contact impulsively. The stakes were too high for assumptions. Verification came first. He reviewed the available information, comparing dates, relationships, and indirect references. The pattern held. There was no contradiction. The connection was not guaranteed, but it was strong enough to justify the next step. The initial message was direct and precise. It did not include speculation. It presented facts, name, date of birth, and the circumstances as he understood them from the documents. It left room for confirmation rather than assertion. Once sent, the message marked a point of no return. The past, which had existed only in records, was now connected to the present. The response came faster than expected. It did not require extended clarification. The recognition was immediate. The information he had provided matched details that had been preserved within the family for decades. The connection that had been severed within the system had been maintained in memory. The search that had once been limited by institutions had adapted over time, shifting into informal networks, personal efforts, and long-term persistence. From that point forward, the pace accelerated. Additional information was exchanged rapidly. Names that had existed only in documents now carried context. Relationships were defined not by paperwork but by continuity. Years of searching, years of waiting, and years of maintaining the belief that the connection had not been permanently lost. The most significant confirmation came through direct comparison of identity markers. Dates aligned. Locations aligned. The sequence of events described in the documents matched the family's account. There was no contradiction between the two sources. What had been recorded officially and what had been remembered privately formed a single, consistent narrative. The distance of nearly 3 decades did not erase that alignment. It intensified it. Within that same period, Caius became aware of the scale of the search that had been conducted without his knowledge. The family had not relied on a single method. They had pursued multiple avenues, legal, personal, and later digital. Each approach had produced partial results but never a complete resolution. The absence of closure had kept the search active, even as time extended the gap. The transition from uncertainty to confirmation occurred within days. The shift from isolation to connection occurred just as quickly. What had remained unresolved for decades began to take shape in real time. For Caius, the most critical realization was not simply that he had found them. It was that they had never stopped looking. The system that had separated them had relied on time to solidify its outcome. It had assumed that distance would weaken connection, that years would diminish persistence, and that absence would eventually become acceptance. That assumption had been wrong. And now, after 33 years, the gap that had been constructed through institutions and decisions was no longer absolute. The confirmation of identity did not conclude the process. It shifted it into a new phase, one that no longer depended on documents or digital traces, but on direct confrontation with everything that had been separated for more than 3 decades. For Caius Arden Vale, the connection established through messages and data was only the beginning. The next step required alignment between 2 lives that had developed independently under completely different conditions. The timeline remained precise. The initial contact occurred in early April 2016. Within days, the exchange of information reached a point where uncertainty was no longer a factor. The consistency between the documented past and the family's account removed any remaining doubt. What remained was the transition from confirmation to presence. A meeting was arranged before the end of that same month. The location was set in Columbus, a point positioned between the places that had defined both sides of the story. The decision was practical, but it also reflected the structure of the situation. There was no shared ground that existed naturally between them. Everything about the connection had to be created deliberately. For Caius, the significance of the meeting was not rooted in expectation. It was rooted in verification. The documents had provided one version of the truth. The digital connection had confirmed it. The in-person meeting would finalize it in a way that no record or message could replicate. It would bring together 2 timelines that had existed in parallel without intersection since 1988. The family he was about to meet had not existed in his daily life. They had not been part of his upbringing, his decisions, or his identity as it had been constructed. Yet the records showed that they had been present in a different way, through continuous effort, repeated attempts, and a refusal to accept the outcome imposed by the system. That contrast defined the moment. When the meeting occurred, the process of confirmation moved beyond data and into direct recognition. The alignment between what had been documented and what was now present did not require interpretation. The consistency was immediate. Names, timelines, and relationships matched without contradiction. The narrative that had been assembled from records was now reinforced by individuals who had lived it. Alaris Nix Rowan's presence carried the weight of everything that had been recorded in the complaint decades earlier. The persistence documented in legal filings now had continuity in the present. The effort had not ended when the system stopped responding. It had continued in forms that were not captured by official records, through memory, through personal networks, and through a sustained refusal to close the search. Selim Drax Rowan's role followed the same pattern. The transition from limited legal standing to full recognition through marriage had been an early step in a longer process. The years that followed had not altered that commitment. The presence of both individuals at the meeting confirmed that the connection had been maintained, even when it had not been visible within institutional structures. Additional family members provided further context. The sibling connection that had led to the initial contact was no longer an abstract link. It became part of a defined structure, relationships that had developed over time, carrying knowledge of the missing member as a constant reference point. The absence of Caius had been integrated into their identity, not as a closed chapter, but as an unresolved element. The most critical aspect of the meeting was not emotional in the traditional sense. It was structural. Every element of the story was tested against reality. The documents had described a sequence of events. The family's account followed that same sequence without deviation. There was no need to reconcile conflicting versions. There was only confirmation. For Caius, that confirmation extended beyond the biological connection. It validated the entire process he had gone through since opening the folder. The doubts, the inconsistencies, the realization of systemic failure, all of it was reinforced by the alignment between recorded evidence and lived experience. At the same time, the meeting introduced a new complexity. The life he had lived did not disappear. His adoptive family remained part of his identity, defined by decades of shared experience. The confirmation of his origin did not replace that history. It added to it. This created a dual structure that had not existed before. Two families, two timelines, and two sets of relationships, all connected through a single individual whose identity had been shaped by both. The system that had separated them had not accounted for this outcome. It had assumed that one structure would replace the other. Instead, both remained. The information exchanged during the meeting extended beyond the initial separation. It included details about the years that followed, the continued search, the attempts to gather information, and the ways in which the family had adapted to the absence. These details filled in the gaps left by the documents, completing the narrative without altering its core. The timeline closed in a way that the system had not intended. The separation that had been enforced through institutional decisions was no longer absolute. The connection that had been denied through legal rulings was now established through direct presence. For Caius, the significance of that moment was not limited to reunion. It was the point at which the past and the present aligned without contradiction. The story that had been fragmented across documents, years, and separate lives became a single, continuous narrative. And once that alignment was achieved, the question was no longer about what had happened. It was about how to carry both parts of that reality forward without losing either one. After the meeting in Columbus, the structure of Caius Arden Vale's life did not collapse. It expanded. What had once been a single, contained identity now existed across two parallel histories, both equally real, both equally valid, and both shaped by a past that could no longer be simplified into a single narrative. The days that followed did not bring immediate clarity. They brought accumulation. Information continued to move in both directions. Details from his biological family that filled gaps the documents could not explain, and details from his own life that had never been part of their understanding. Each piece added depth, but also complexity. The story did not resolve into something easier. It became more complete. Caius approached this phase the same way he had approached the investigation, with structure and control. He did not attempt to replace one life with another. He did not frame the situation as a choice between families. The records had already made one fact undeniable. His life had been shaped by forces outside his control. What remained within his control was how those realities would coexist moving forward. His adoptive family remained part of that structure. The documents had shown no evidence that they had participated in the manipulation that led to his placement. Their role began within a system that had presented itself as legitimate. That distinction mattered. It defined responsibility, and it prevented the narrative from collapsing into blame that could not be supported by evidence. At the same time, the connection to his biological family was no longer theoretical. It was present, defined, and active. The years of separation had not erased that connection. They had delayed it. What had been lost in time was not erased in meaning. Balancing those two realities required a deliberate approach. Caius did not rely on instinct or emotion alone. He defined boundaries, roles, and expectations, not through conversation, but through consistency. Each family occupied a space in his life that did not overlap in a way that created conflict. Instead, they existed in parallel, connected through him but not forced into a single structure. The legal aspect of the situation remained unchanged. The documents confirmed what he had already begun to understand. Any possibility of formal accountability had expired. The events that led to his removal occurred decades earlier, within a system that had already processed and closed the case. Statutes of limitation, institutional inertia, and the passage of time combined to make legal resolution impossible. That outcome did not come as a surprise. It aligned with the pattern he had already seen in the records. The system that had allowed the separation had also created the conditions that prevented correction. By the time the truth could be fully assembled, the mechanisms for addressing it no longer applied. Caius did not attempt to challenge that reality. Instead, he redirected the focus toward something that could still be changed. The story did not remain private. Over time, he began to share the details of what had happened, not as a personal narrative seeking sympathy, but as a documented account of how a system had functioned. The information he had gathered, combined with the confirmation provided by his biological family, created a complete record that extended beyond his individual case. The purpose of sharing was not retrospective justice. It was prevention. The pattern he had uncovered was not limited to his own experience. The references to other cases, the repeated structures, and the institutional behaviors indicated that what had happened to him was part of a broader issue. By bringing that pattern into the present, he introduced visibility where there had previously been fragmentation. The response that followed reflected a shift that the original system had not accounted for. Information that had once been isolated within individual files became part of a larger conversation. Other cases surfaced. Other individuals recognized similarities in their own histories. The narrative expanded beyond one person into a collective awareness of how such systems had operated. For Caius, this transformation marked the final stage of the process. The search for identity had led to discovery. Discovery had led to connection. Connection had led to understanding. And understanding ultimately led to responsibility. His life remained divided in origin but unified in direction. He did not define himself by the system that had taken him or by the families that had shaped him. He defined himself by the choice he made after learning the truth, to hold both realities without rejecting either, and to use that truth in a way that extended beyond his own story. The past could not be undone. The years could not be recovered. The system that had allowed it all to happen could not be held accountable in the way it should have been. But the silence that had protected it no longer existed. And that changed something fundamental, because in the end, what defines a life is not only where it begins, but what is done with the truth once it is finally uncovered. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Your attention, your presence, and your willingness to stay until the very end truly mean more than you might realize. Stories like this are not just about what happened in the past. They are about understanding, reflection, and the quiet truths that often remain hidden for years. What we can take away from this journey is simple, yet powerful. Life does not always begin the way we are told it does. Truth can be delayed, hidden, or even taken away, but it does not disappear. And when it finally comes to light, it has the power to reshape everything we thought we knew. At the same time, this story reminds us that identity is not defined by a single moment, but by the choices we make after we learn the truth. It also shows us the strength of human connection. Even when separated by time, distance, and circumstances beyond control, real bonds do not simply vanish. They endure quietly until the moment they can be found again. If the story moved you in any way, if it made you think, reflect, or feel something deeper, then the greatest support you can give us is very simple. Please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories like this to more people around the world. Thank you again for being here.